The life of St. John of Beverly, Bishop of York. Our Holy Father John was born of noble parents at Harpham, Yorkshire, in the 7th century. As a youth, he studied under Sts. Theodore and Adrian at Canterbury, and then under St. Enfleda at the Double Monastery at Whitby. After leaving the monastery, he used his great rhetorical gifts as a missionary to the unenlightened English. He was also endowed with the gift of healing. One of his disciples at this time was the Venerable Bede, whom St. John later raised to the diaconate and priesthood. On August 25, 687, John was consecrated Bishop of Hexham in succession to St. Eata. Here he continued his holy life and the working of miracles. During fasting periods, he would retire to a cemetery near Hexham, which is now called St. John's Lee. And once, at the beginning of Great Lent, he healed a dumb man who used to come to him for alms by simply making the sign of the cross on his tongue. Another time, he healed a nun at the monastery of Wetterdun by praying over her. Once the bishop went to consecrate a church and was urged to eat with a local nobleman named Earl Pugh, whose wife was sick. St. John sent one of the monks to the woman with some holy water that he had blessed for the consecration. After washing herself in the water, the woman rose from her sick bed and immediately, like the Apostle Peter's mother-in-law, served the bishop and her husband at table. Again, Earl Addy's servant lay mortally ill. The bishop went to visit him and saw the dying man with the coffin at his side and all those present weeping. Then he said a prayer, blessed him, and said, "May you soon recover." Later, the servant asked his lord for a cup of wine, and the earl sent him a cup blessed by the bishop. Immediately he drank of it, he was cured, and joined the earl and the bishop at table. The following miracle was related by Abbot Heribold, one of the bishop's clergy. When in the prime of my youth, I lived among his clergy, applying myself to reading and singing, but not having altogether withdrawn my heart from youthful pleasures, we came into a plain and open road, well adapted for galloping our horse. The young men that were with him, and particularly those of the laity, began to entreat the bishop to allow them to gallop and make trial of the goodness of their horses. He at first refused, saying that it was an idle request. But finally, being prevailed upon by all, he said, "Do so if you want, but let Heribold have not part in the trial." I earnestly prayed that I might have leave to ride with the rest, for I relied on an excellent horse which he had given me, but I could not obtain my request. When they had galloped backwards and forwards several times, with the bishop and I looking on, my wanton humour prevailed, and I could no longer refrain, and in spite of his refusal, I joined the rest and began to ride at full speed, at which I heard him call after me, "Alas, how much you grieve me by riding like that." Although I heard him, I continued against his command, but as the fiery horse leapt over a hollow, I fell motionless and lost consciousness, as if dead. For there was a stone in that place covered with turf, the only stone in the whole plain. And it happened, as a punishment for my disobedience, that my head and hand, which in falling had clapped to my head, hit the stone, so that my thumb was broken and my skull cracked, and I lay, as I said, as one dead. And since I could not move, they stretched a canopy for me to lie in. It was about the 7th hour of the day, and having lain still, and as it were dead from that time. Till the evening, I then revived a little, and was carried home by my companions, but lay speechless all night, vomiting blood, because something had been broken inside me by the fall. The bishop was very grieved at my misfortune, and expected my death, for he had an extraordinary affection for me. Nor would he stay that night, as was his habit among his clergy, but spent it all only in watching and prayer, imploring the divine goodness, as I imagine, for my health. Coming to me early in the morning, and having said a prayer over me, he called me by my name, and as it were waking me out of a heavy sleep, asked whether I knew who it was who was speaking with me. I opened my eyes and said, "I do. You are my beloved bishop." "Can you live?" he said. I answered, "I may through your prayers, if the Lord wills." He then laid his hand on my head, blessed me, and returned to prayer. When he came to see me again a little later, he found me sitting and able to talk, and moved by a divine instinct, began to ask me whether I knew for certain that I had been baptized. I answered, "I know for certain that I have been washed in the laver of salvation for the remission of my sins." And I named the priest by whom I knew that I had been baptized. He replied, "If you were baptized by that priest, your baptism is not perfect, for I know him, and I know that because of his lack of intelligence, he was unable to learn the ministry of catechism and baptism, which is why I ordered him to desist from his presumptuous exercise of his ministry, which he could not duly perform." Having said this, he took care to catechize me at that very time. Then he blew on my face, and I felt better. He called the surgeon and ordered him to close and bind up my skull where it was cracked. And having received his blessing, I was so much better that the next day I mounted on horseback and traveled with him to another place. And when, a little later, I had completely recovered, I received the baptism of life. In 705, on the death of Bishop Bosa, St. John became Bishop of York. Once he was present at a great council of King Osred of Northumbria and his nobles. After the council, he was invited to a meal by the king, and during the meal, St. John ordered 3 jars to be filled, one with wine, one with mead, and one with beer. After the bishop had blessed the jars, they were found to be inexhaustible, recalling the miracles of the Lord himself at Cana and in the feeding of the 5,000. Then King Osred called Brithred the butler to him and congratulated him, saying, "Now we have been convinced of the sanctity of your Lord by the virtue of that which we see." Once during his travels, St. John came to a beautiful spot, in a land of wild forests and waters, in the midst of which stood a church dedicated to St. John the Divine. From the nearby stream, which abounded in beavers, it was known as Beverly, Beaver Stream. Here, Bishop John bought some land, enlarged and beautified the church, and made it into a double monastery which he richly endowed. Once St. John came to the monastery at Beverly, as Abbot Brithen tells the tale. After the bishop had inspected the monastery and conducted long services, the abbot suggested that he have a bath. And after the bath, the abbot offered the bishop some wine. The bishop assented, and Brithred the butler was ordered to take the glass of wine to him. But Brithred carelessly left the flask hanging in an exposed place on the wall, and it fell down and broke. Miraculously, however, the wine did not run out, but remained within the broken pieces of the flask. The bishop liked to pray in the Basilica of the Archangel Michael in York, which was next to his house. While he was praying there, the Holy Spirit was seen hovering over his head in the form of a white dove. At the same time, a blinding light was seen coming out of the apertures of the church, which amazed all those who saw it. At length, St. John's deacon, whose name was Sigga, unbolted the door, entered the church, and saw the majestic vision of the bishop praying with arms outstretched in a blinding light, and with a snow-white dove hovering over his head. Immediately, the skin of his face wrinkled up as if it had been boiled. Sensing that he was being watched, the saint turned round. Coming up to Sigga, he healed his face by a simple couch, but warned him not to relate what he had seen during his lifetime. Great crowds of people would come to the bishop when he was performing the mystery of holy unction. Once they brought a dead man up to him, and after the bishop had anointed him with the holy oil, he arose. The bishop similarly used to drive demons out of people and healed the sick wherever he found them. Having been a bishop for 33 years, 8 months, and 13 days, St. John resigned from his see in 717 and retired to the monastery he had founded at Beverly. 4 years later, on May 7th, 721, he reposed and was buried in the porch of St. John the Theologian. Through his prayers, many miracles continued to be wrought at his tomb after his death. Demons were expelled, the blind, the deaf, the mute, and the lame were healed, and all kinds of sorrows were removed. Before the great battle of Brunanburg in 937, King Athelstan prayed at the shrine of St. John of Beverly. That night, St. John appeared to him in his sleep and promised him victory. In gratitude, the king, on returning from the battlefield, endowed the church with many rich gifts. In 1037, St. John was glorified by Pope Benedict IX, and Aelfric, Archbishop of York, translated his relics to a more costly shrine, sparkling with gold and precious stones. During the Norman conquest, a band of Normans marched into Beverly to pillage the shrine. Their leader, whose name was Taustein, seeing an old man dressed in gold bracelets, galloped towards him with his sword drawn. The old man fled, terrified, to the church. Taustein pursued him through the gates of the churchyard. But at that moment, the horse slipped on the pavement, and Taustein fell to the ground, stunned. The Normans regarded this as the wrath of St. John and fled. Indeed, according to the 12th century writer John Brampton, the territory of St. John was the only land in the whole of the north of England which did not suffer from the depredations of the Normans. St. John's shrine was probably destroyed by fire in 1188. But 5 years later, his bones were discovered, and in 1308, a new shrine was completed. The relics were hidden during the Protestant dissolution of the monasteries, but in 1604 they were found again in a case of lead. They were brought to light again when the nave was repaved in 1736, and are now interred in the minster beneath a slab in the nave floor near the choir stalls. The Orthodox Church celebrates the memory of St. John of Beverly on May 7th. Holy Bishop John, pray to God for us.